Hello and welcome. My name is Gareth Ragg, and I would like to welcome you to the Reuters event Build Back Better Symposium. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we kick off, I would like to thank all of our speakers, moderators, and partners for making this symposium possible. The global pandemic currently gripping our world has brought untold devastation to millions of people, striking deep both on the economic and social foundations of our society. Emergency measures aimed at preventing the spread of the virus have rightly placed the well-being of individuals at centre stage. However, as the lockdowns begin to ease across the world and the countries attempt to reboot their economies, the Reuters event's Build Back Better Symposium over the next 3 hours will explore how the climate recovery through the energy transition can be placed front and centre of the plans for an economic recovery post-COVID-19. But before I pass over to our first panel and Nigel Topping, there's just a few brief bits of housekeeping from me. Firstly, everyone tuning in with us live right now has the ability to ask questions directly to our expert speakers and panelists. You can do that via Slido, which if you're watching the screen right now, you can do literally straight underneath where I am pointing underneath the stream. Or if you would prefer, you can log on to the Slido website, that is SLIDO, and use the code ENERGY2020. That's ENERGY2020 when you get there to log in, and then you can put your questions to our speakers and panelists. Secondly, all of today's discussions will be available free and on demand after we finish. So please do spread the word with any colleagues, clients, friends, or wider communities who you think will be interested in the discussions that we are having today. Simply just share the web link that's in your browser as you're watching today. That's all from me for the next few moments. I hope you find the next few hours of discussions both valuable and enjoyable on what I think is an incredibly timely and important subject. And with that, I'd like to pass over to Nigel Topping, who's the UK High-Level Climate Action Champion. Thanks, Nigel, and over to you.
Thank you, Gareth, and good morning, afternoon, or evening to everybody, wherever you are, and welcome. Thanks also to Reuters for putting on this symposium. As Gareth says, very timely, and this is the first session where we're really going to explore the extent to which the crisis can be used as a catalyst to accelerate the energy transition. As Gareth says, I have this wonderful role of high-level climate action champion. I work closely with my colleague Gonzalo Munoz from Chile, and just over a month ago we launched a Race to Zero, a global campaign to get as many businesses, cities, investors, regions, universities, schools, sports clubs to commit to net zero as soon as possible, but by 2050 at the latest. Incredible response, already well over 2,000 entities, which between them cover over 50% of the world economy. That continues to grow. Just today I heard that the last Australian state has committed to net zero. So actually the whole of Australia, not at the federal level, but if you add up all of the states, is now committed to net zero by 2050. So we're going to explore this topic of how do we accelerate the transition to the zero carbon economy, and to what extent can the lessons learned and the responses to the COVID-19 pandemic act as catalysts for that to happen even faster than it was already happening. We've got a great panel. We've got Fiona Reynolds from the PRI, Judith Hartman from ENGIE, Arunabha Ghosh from the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, and Jennifer Lake from WRI. I'm going to go to each of those in turn, ask them a couple of questions, and then we'll have a discussion at the end, and then wrap up with some Q&A from the audience on the Slido. So do start putting your questions on Slido and voting for the ones which you think are most important. Let me start then with Fiona. Fiona, you work with a massive group of investors. I can't remember last time, I think 86 trillion of assets under management or something like that.
100 now.
100 now, there you go.
Yeah.
What are investors looking to governments to do to accelerate the transition, the energy transition? What are you hearing from investors, and what are they saying to governments?
Sure. Well, anyway, congratulations, Nigel, on that great result on the Race to Zero. That's fantastic, and certainly helping things along. And thanks for the opportunity to speak. I really hope that everyone out there is safe and well. I think, well, in terms of what investors are doing, it might be stating the obvious, but with stimulus packages totaling somewhere between 10 and $20 trillion, what we do today, tomorrow, and over the next year is really going to shape the future of our economy and our society for decades to come. And the private sector, businesses, investors, obviously need to play their role in providing solutions, which is what we're trying to do. And governments alone are not going to be able to fund the transformation that we need. And I think that's really evident by the growing debt to GDP ratios of governments around the world. And we all know that we've got an opportunity to build back better and in a different way, and that we can shape a new normal and really include environmental and social aims at the heart of that new normal. So in our view, we've really got two ways to go. We either keep on our current trajectory and lock in high carbon pathways in the world of the past, or we accelerate the green transition and we build an economy that's fit for the 21st century and importantly builds jobs and skills that we need for the future. And, we're certainly trying to push for the latter. And I think that we're in a good position because I'd say that sustainability is really high on the agenda at the moment. I think that people have finally started to realise that preconditions to a healthy economy are having healthy people and a healthy planet, and the three must come together. So in terms of our discussions with governments, so in May we with 400 investors wrote with CDP and IIGCC, we engaged with the G7 and the G20 countries, and the things that we've been talking to them is number one, that we need to prioritise human relief and job creation without locking in high carbon pathways. So recovery plans should create jobs across the society. I mean, what is every government at the moment going to need to do? Create jobs. But we can do that in a way that matches investment in the zero emissions energy transition, industrials, building and transport systems, and climate resilience measures. So let's create the green jobs of the future. We're also saying that we want to support the green deals around the world, wherever they may be. And we really want governments to be upholding the Paris Agreement. And that anything that happens that drives forward the ambitions to be at net zero by 2050. We're also saying that we should ensure that COVID-19 support addresses climate risk, in particular in carbon-intensive companies that receive government bailouts, grants, loans, tax concessions, etc. That none of these should come condition-free. That if we're looking at different sectors, that we should, and you're getting taxpayers' money, that there should be conditions attached that help drive the transition. That we should prioritise climate resilience and net zero solutions, economic solutions. We don't believe that locking in carbon-intensive economic activities in pursuit of recovery plans is the way to go, that it's only going to exacerbate the problem. And lastly, we're talking about really embedding investor participation in the recovery plan. As I said in the beginning, without governments alone are not going to be able to do this. Investors and finance is required. So we need to have a good dialogue about how we get that investment flowing and in the way in which investors want to see it happen. But I think we need to bring the discussion together. It's not all about green. It's about making sure that we have a sustainable and inclusive recovery that creates jobs and skills that we need as well. And we can do both. And we've got a fantastic opportunity and we need not to blow it, basically.
Yeah. And we need not to blow it like we did in 2008, when I think only about a sixth of the recovery spend was spent, if you like, tilting the economy towards the kind of future that you've just described. Fiona, before I move over to Judith, just tell us a little bit about basically you painted a picture there of like a plea for macroeconomic common sense, right? Let's not mess this up. Let's build a desirable future. Let's build sustainable jobs. Let's not invest in assets that are going to become stranded. But you're also working, I know, with a lot of asset owners at a very granular level. And tell us a little bit about some of the big initiatives that are growing in momentum at the moment amongst the asset.
Sure. Well, I think with in the investment community, we've got a couple of ways that we can use our leverage. First of all is how we allocate capital, or where we don't allocate capital. And then it's in our engagement with companies and our engagement with government. So I talked about the engagement with government. I think one of the key initiatives that we have in terms of engagement with companies is Climate Action 100 Plus. So it's 450 investors representing 45 trillion in assets under management and engaging with around about the largest 100 emitters in the world. And we've got 3 key asks. So one is to set an emissions reduction target. The other is to report in line with the TCFD. And the third is around governance. So trying to understand the decisions that boards are making and how they're factoring in climate change and being able to explain it to us. It's been a very successful initiative. If I look at the oil and gas sector and we look at some recent wins through engagement of Climate Action 100 Plus, we've seen Shell come out with its commitment to net zero emissions energy business by 2050 or sooner, and a total operations approach to this. We've also seen Total commit to net zero and take, it's got 3 major steps that it's going to take. We've seen BP make a commitment to become net zero as well. And we're seeing major companies like Shell, like AGL, who are tying executive compensation to this transition as well. So very coordinated engagement is working. Of course, then it's not good enough for investors to just tell companies that what they want them to do and what they expect them to do. So we also, with our sister organisation, UNFFI, created the UN Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. So this at the moment is a group of 30 institutional investors, all asset owners. It's continuing to grow, who have committed to net zero by 2050 themselves. They represent nearly 4.7 trillion in assets under management. Now, it's not just a commitment signing a piece of paper. This is a deep commitment. The asset owners are working together. They're about to come out with their short-term target. That'll be a 2025 target. And then we're working together on what do we need to do and how do we get there. That will be important because it'll drive more conversation with business, because we can't get to net zero within the investment community, within our portfolios, unless we A, change what investment managers do, and B, change what companies are doing. So I see this as a very big major commitment. So that's really where we're doing engaging with government, engaging with with companies, engaging with investment managers, and making commitments ourselves to net zero and driving them forward.
Fantastic. And you just give a real sense of how this is a systemic change. So you talk about policy, you talk about asset owners changing their own portfolios, you talk about the engagement. I know we'll hear late in one of the later sessions from Dylan Tanner from Influence Map, how's lobbying playing out. And I know a lot of the Climate Action 100 Plus has been getting investors to encourage businesses to be more transparent and more aligned in their trade body and their lobbying initiatives. Thank you, Fiona. Really, really helpful. Let me turn to Judith now. Judith, really, you would expect somebody running an organisation that's all about sustainability, like Fiona, to be really gung ho about the transition. But you're a CFO, right? You're having to make very hard-nosed capital investment and corporate financing decisions. So it's really great to have you on the panel. And tell us a little bit about how from your perspective, do you see us accelerating investment in clean technologies, particularly in the context we have in our sort of fiscal tightening? What are the kind of moves that will help you go faster?
So thank you for this introduction. And first of all, I think it's a great opportunity to remind ourselves that the environment and the economy don't have to be a contradiction. Indeed, we are very committed as an energy company, and we have been over the last few years to reduce our emissions. We have reduced our emissions by about 50% in the last 5 years, and also with the conviction that does indeed create value. That it's not just the right thing to do for the environment, but that it is a big opportunity also to create value in terms of first of all making sure that, of course, our assets remain future-proof, And I think this is a very important topic indeed on our discussion here on how to rebuild this economy. I think it is incredible. There's trillions available here that are being put on the table, and we have to make sure that we use these amounts in a way that we actually make a better planet and build a better future. We knew before the COVID crisis that we needed to act more decisively on combating climate change. But I think what this crisis brings to the forefront is just the interdependencies between us all, and the fact that that a health crisis or an environmental crisis can also lead to a lot of economic pressure. So I think we need to look at this as an opportunity. It's interesting that you compared it to 2008, which was, of course, a big crisis for many. At the same time, when you look at the economic impact this time around, I think we would all agree that it's X times, much more significant than what we saw in 2008. So all the more important to find now the right areas where we can invest, as well as speed. I would say speed. We've been collectively, I think, very impressed by the reaction and the commitment of the governments to put a lot of money available. This will be necessary, of course, or else we're going to run into a lot of unemployment also. But I would really hope that we can now act with speed to see where the funds are available. Certainly, I can talk for our company. We're very committed to investing into renewables, both on the electricity side, but also on the gas side. And then, of course, anything to do with driving more efficient infrastructures around district heating and cooling, for example, which are often, easily 10% more efficient than if everybody does their individual heating and cooling. So I think speed is of the essence here for many reasons, to relaunch the economy as well as employment, but also indeed, as we knew before the crisis already, combating climate change is a more and more pressing issue. And so the faster we can go, the better it will be.
Great. Thanks, Julia. I think I'm struck that crudely we could split clean technologies into those where there's already a business case. So a lot of the energy efficiency solutions, renewables, we know levelized cost of electricity cheaper even than existing fossil fuels in many parts of the world. But there are some technologies that are newer, like EVs, hydrogen, which we know will need to be part of the solution. Like we can't get there with renewables. And where maybe the business case isn't made yet. I mean, how do we accelerate through to get the cost curve down so that then the market can just take off with those kind of technologies?
Indeed, that's a very good distinction. I look at the decade behind us as the decade where wind and solar have become economic and very widespread. It all seems like such an obvious thing now, but I remember innumerable discussions 10 years ago where people thought that solar was always going to be way too expensive and was never going to make any economic sense. Now, of course, costs have come down dramatically on solar and wind. On wind, also by about 50%. We have really multiplied collectively as energy players the investments into this. It's now completely mainstream. By the way, great opportunity. Doesn't mean we should stop here. ENGIE alone has about a pipeline of 50 gigawatts of renewables to come, and a commitment to install at least 3 a year. We're committed to increase investing around this, and so I think we should not forget that piece that is now, you can call it mainstream. Like you said, the technology is there, it's economically viable, and I think there's still a lot of opportunities to invest here. And again, what I would say also to governments there is speed of making the funds available, of doing the bids, but also on the permitting, because some of the paperwork takes a lot of time to get it done. And I think if we have the right regulation and making sure that we can speed those things up, that will be great. And then I look at the next decade that we have in front of us here. And I do believe indeed that this could be the decade where greening of gas would become much more mainstream. Biogas is available now. We are a leader of biogas, for example, in France. When I look at it, though, you know, there's a lot of room still to grow in terms of percentage in the actual gas consumption. And then, of course, green hydrogen. This needs to be the decade where we scale it up. When you hear me talk about wind, where we were able to reduce collectively costs dramatically, in green hydrogen, we only, quote unquote, have to reduce by 50% also the cost. And I do believe by scaling up, this will be a very a great opportunity for the next chapter. And again, last but not least, I think those go together very well. The electricity part of renewables is, of course, very intermittent. Gas has the advantage of being much easier to transport, much easier to store, much cheaper to transport and to store. So if we can find a way to combine those, I think there's really a lot to gain.
Yeah. Great, and of course we've seen really strong moves on hydrogen in both China and the EU recently. Really, I think encouraging a lot to think that we are going to come down that cost curve quite quickly. Great, thank you, Judith. Really helpful. One thing which Judith didn't mention that we've seen work as a policy measure is a clear end date. You know, so in the UK said end of coal 2025. Now we're I think 3 months without burning any coal. Germany's just said 2038. Everyone thinks that'll probably happen earlier. I want to turn to Aaron Arber and talk about the difference, the different geopolitics of energy transition in the world's biggest democracy, in India, and how those kind of issues of you know, eventually getting off coal, eventually transitioning to you know, mass electric transport instead of scaling up transport based on the internal combustion engine. So Aaron Arber, how are things playing out? I know we've seen Modi talk about more investment in coal, which seems to be sort of confusing given the leading role that India has played late in the last few years of really accelerating renewables investment. So give us a little bit of the perspective from India on how the energy transition is playing out there, Aaron Arber.
Sure. Thanks, Nigel, and thanks to Reuters for having me here. It's great to be on this panel and discuss how we can build back better. Before I answer your question directly, I just wanted to reflect on this question, the broader question about how do we accelerate the transition. And I think the biggest opportunity here is that, notwithstanding the terrible humanitarian crisis that the pandemic has thrown up before us, it has also played out for us what a planetary scale shock looks like. You know, and that's the difference between 2020 and 2008. When you were reflecting earlier, Nigel, about why we didn't invest as much in the economy of the future. So what the pandemic is telling us is that planetary scale shocks are not just public health issues, environmental issues, they're core to how we live, work, and make money. The problem, however, would be if our current attention on the acuteness of this crisis takes our attention away from the importance of the chronic crisis which long-term climate change presents before us. So what is going on in India? Number one is, you know, we've still not hit the peak. So we had the most stringent lockdown in the world. And as the economy is gradually opening up, the cases are still rising. So a lot of these government announcements so far have been primarily on the side of the relief measures. So it's a big announcement about $260 billion, about 10% of GDP, but a lot of it is focused on helping migrant workers, the agricultural sector, bringing cash injections into the micro, small, medium enterprises and so forth. So we still have an opportunity to think about what would the stimulus then really look like, you know, whenever it comes and whatever form it comes in. So you're right, there are some contradictory signals. That on one hand, there's been this announcement about a big push for coal again. However, I think the markets are simply not going to respond for the same reasons that the markets have not responded in the past few years when India has proposed that it's going to dig more coal.
Or in America, right, where Trump promised to bring back coal.
Exactly.
We've seen coal plants shut.
And in India's case, exactly. I mean, of course, the political dynamics are different between the US and India. But in India's case, every time that announcement is made, it's primarily around the issue of energy security and can we reduce coal imports and dig up more coal at home.
Right.
But when you actually look at where the numbers are, after the government made the announcement of coal, last week we had a record solar tariff. You know, so we went from 2.44 rupees per unit, which is we kind of plateaued there 3 years ago, to 2.36 rupees. That's 3 US cents. Earlier this year, we had, and increasingly there are tenders around what I call round-the-clock tenders. So it's solar or wind plus storage, whatever form you take it. And that is increasingly beating thermal power. Even if you add the storage costs of whether it's battery-based or it's pumped hydro and so forth. So the electricity decarbonization story is continuing. And if you recall what the Prime Minister said at the Climate Action Summit last year, and India, the government has kept harping on that message, is that we're not sticking to 175 gigawatts of renewables. We're pushing for 450 gigawatts of renewables. That would be, and that's not counting large hydro. So that would be one of the largest markets in the world.
Yeah.
The issue here, Nigel, is how do we get more money coming into emerging economies like India faster? We are averaging about $9.5 to $10.5 billion a year. We need to ramp that up about 3 times, between $30 to $35 billion we need every year to be able to get to 450 gigawatts of renewables. Now, it's not just India's story. Money does not flow where the sun shines the most. So emerging economies like India, can keep putting out the targets, but the de-risking of that capital investment, the institutional investment, is still something that's holding back the big bags of capital coming into the emerging economies. So we've got to solve for that. There will be a third element beyond the policy targets and the finance. It's going to be technology. Very recently, the government of India has also constituted a task force, I'm part of it, on coming out new science, technology, and innovation policy for India. India has had only 4 such policies since 1947 when we became independent.
Right.
And the big push for this is that the pandemic has given a shock. It's given a jolt to the system. Yeah. What kind of tech should we be investing in on our own and in collaboration with others? And that's the part about the hard-to-abate sectors that we should be thinking about, heavy industry and so forth.
Great. Now, I want to just ask you, I know you just published something on jobs and growth, but as you were speaking about, it's always helpful to get your view on the real geopolitics of that coal. This is more about it's more a play towards the energy security fear, even though it won't actually play out in the market like that. One other thing that we've heard of a lot is in Indian cities, but around the world, is that people have one of the plus sides of the shocks is people have experienced clean air. Yeah. So I'd like you just to say a little bit about your work on jobs, but also what's the effect of people being able to see the Himalayas for the first time in a generation in terms of changing what people want and what people expect from the energy sector going forward?
Nigel, you mentioned that India is the world's largest democracy. So if you were a political leader, you would be worried about the job losses. At some estimates, about 27 million job losses in the month of May alone, right? And India has the world's largest young population.
Yeah.
So we can't have these 15 to 25-year-olds without employment, right? So the biggest political hook that, again, the pandemic gives us an opportunity to use, which wasn't there earlier as much, is actually the jobs hook. What kind of new jobs will come? So let me just give some, stark contrast. Coal India, the world's largest individual coal producer, has about 270,000 employees. If we get to just the current target of 160 gigawatts of solar and wind, we create a workforce of 330,000 people. Right. Now, more than that, distributed renewables is an even greater opportunity. The employment coefficient in India is 7 times more than for utility scale solar. which of course has more jobs per unit than thermal power. So when we begin to think about it this way, that every 4 gigawatts of rooftop solar creates 50,000 more jobs, there's an opportunity of $50 billion in using distributed renewables in the rural economy using technologies that already exist.
Right.
Then you're basically democratizing the energy transition because you're giving people who've lost their jobs very recently a very new hook that they can hold on to. The political economy will still play out. You know, this classic insider-outsider problem that all countries face will require targeted interventions. But even when we think about the harder to abate sectors, et cetera, there's an opportunity.
Yeah.
Our estimates at CEW suggest that the hydrogen supply chain alone, the green hydrogen supply chain alone, could create 1.9 million jobs in India over the next 2.5 decades. India is the hottest country in terms of cooling demand. And we were the first country that came out with a cooling action plan in the world. Now, just air conditioning technicians that we need in India over the next 2 decades, another 2 million.
Yeah.
So when you, and I'm not talking about the spillover ancillary impact that it has.
No.
So when you start adding all of this up, you get a very different narrative. And that's why the document we came out with on jobs growth and sustainability, we're targeting the line ministries that don't really talk about energy and climate change. It's the micro, small, medium enterprise ministry, the road transport, the textile ministry. These are the places where the jobs are.
Yeah.
Tourism sector. And once you begin to socialize the energy transition into the broader economy, you have a bigger political driver than anything we had before.
Yeah, no, I think that's what lovely note to end on, Anurag. I think just being much more aware of the political reality of some of the kind of policy changes that are needed, and as you say, the fact that distributed solar really particularly plays to a very powerful rural political community in India, and that there's an even bigger jobs multiple there. Really helpful. Thank you. Let me turn now to Jennifer, who leads the energy work at WRI, the World Resources Institute. And Jennifer, I know you've been tracking carefully the recovery packages as they come in. So maybe you could just give us a state of play, like how are governments around the world doing? And in particular, maybe you could just draw out that distinction which Anurag referred to between the relief measures, like just got to keep people in work. Like you can't, if you have a green relief measure, which means people lose millions of jobs, then it's all over, right? So just help us a little bit. How do you think about the kind of immediate relief measures and the recovery measures and the sort of gray area in between, and how are we doing?
Right. Well, thank you all for those excellent remarks. It's wonderful to have the benefit of looking across your organizations and the work that you're tracking, and to be the one that kind of helps to try and pull some of these strands together. In short, we are not seeing a green, low carbon stimulus program emerge as the dominant method that policymakers are using in their COVID response. I am a technology optimist, and I remain a believer that the solutions that we've discussed hold much more promise. Unfortunately, the institutional incumbency continues to make those political economy questions really, really challenging. I think there are a few things. We've now looked at about $509 billion that is intended to be spent in high carbon industries around the world. And there are very few countries that are setting conditions on their stimulus measures for support. Right now, one estimate that we've been tracking is that we've got about somewhere between 12 and $13 billion emerging for low carbon industry, where we're seeing about $19 billion going into high carbon industry. And that's just that small portion of the $509 billion that we've been able to look in those two categories. I think that there are some countries that are working to make some of this more explicit, right? We've seen Canada come out indicating that they do expect a low carbon transition for stimulus. We know Germany's plans around hydrogen and other low carbon technologies are quite forward and progressive, leaning for those technologies. But we also see very divergent approaches within any one government. Let me note South Korea, which has a very strong statement about a low carbon technology, and yet their Export-Import Bank is continuing to fund a coal project in Indonesia that is going forward as part of the stimulus program. So we know that these institutions are not always 100% aligned between the political will of the government at the highest levels to balance these factors and the very real challenges that are faced by day-to-day decision making when there's an industry that employs so many people that is impacted in a way by this stimulus, by this pandemic and the economic crisis. I will also note that we are continuing to work on the Belt and Road Initiative tracking that we started in 2018 as the Belt and Road programs were being cited as stimulating more fossil investment than they were clean energy investment. And inside China, over the last year and a half, we have seen the political dynamics of the local provincial level signing off on more fossil plants, signing off on more coal plants that had been in the pipeline, but at a time where their coal facilities are operating at less than 45% capacity, they are still continuing to build new coal facilities. So we know that these are stranded assets. We know that the long-term economic pathway is undermined by some of the kinds of short-term measures that we're seeing in these stimulus programs. And I think that it's important that we don't look to governments exclusively as needing to change and shift. And I was very appreciative of Fiona's notes about where the private sector and investment community are, because in fact, we have to lean heavily into our private sector colleagues in order to help make these shifts happen. I'm just going to cite in the United States that oil and gas industry right now has received royalty relief of $3 billion. They've claimed of the $3 trillion of the stimulus programs in the United States, the oil and gas claims have come in at 1.9 billion of that. We have a much smaller portion of that going into any kind of renewable or energy efficiency programming in the United States. So although the highest level targets, even in the private sector, continue to evolve for net zero in the long term, we do continue to see some of those issues associated with the structural conditions and of their businesses being successful in the short term. So anything we can do at this juncture to support corporate governance shifts to long-term technology investments, we need to do through public-private partnerships, through local state government and local government engagement, and through civil society, and looking at where and how the next generation is going to be looking for technologies, and from business to business engagement, right? With the renewable energy agenda, Nigel, as you know from your work on this, has benefited tremendously, not just from policy support, but from the private sector markets where corporations are putting in long-term plans to purchase renewable energy.
So let's use that as a segue into into discussion around some of those dynamics in the private sector. You just referred, Jennifer, to some US oil and gas companies tapping into relief funds, but of course we've seen massive balance sheet write-downs from some of the companies that Fiona's investor friends have been engaging with. I think is it 17.5 billion at BP and 22 billion at Shell and 4.8 at Rep. I mean, that's nearly 50 billion from just three companies. Of course, we've seen a massive reduction in CapEx commitments in terms of upstream investment, in particular from that sector. So maybe we're focusing too much on green recovery measures in some areas in the market. I mean, it's a little bit like Aaron Abba was telling us about the reality of, or the difference between the rhetoric of coal in India, and as we discussed in very different circumstances in America, and the reality of what the market's doing. So, just anybody, what has the market? Are investors and boardrooms deciding now that this transition to zero carbon economy is inevitable, and are they aligning their balance sheets and their capex portfolios and pipelines with that? Are we just seeing the last dying flicks of the tail of industries grasping for recovery funds, even though it makes no sense in terms of the competitiveness of those companies or of those countries? So any views? Maybe start with oil and gas, but I'm particularly interested, in the utility sector, Judith, and beyond into automotive, some of the hard to abate sectors that Aaron Arbour was talking about. And what kind of dynamics are we seeing there in terms of, if you like, sorting out who are the winners going to be and who are the losers going to be?
I think it's great that you bring this up because it ties back to what we said earlier on the link between the environment and wanting to be economically successful. You have just talked about 50 billion of write-downs. I mean, that's a pretty significant check and a pretty significant value destruction, I would call it, for some of these companies. So again, for me, the conviction is that if you want to be successful in the future, you have to build something that is gonna last for the future. Our industries are very long-term thinking, and these assets are on the balance sheet for decades, depending on the technology. So you want to build something that will last, and that is going to be as relevant in 10 or 20 years from now, or 30 years from now. When we took the decision to exit coal in 2015, coal was 10% of our results. So it was not an easy decision. There was people who thought that this was indeed a complicated proposition from a financial perspective. I'm still very convinced now with hindsight. Of course, it seems a very obvious decision. It wasn't at the time, and so I'm glad we did it. And we have to continue down this path. We have, you asked the question on discussions in the boardroom or when decisions are taken. We have committed, we are certified as a company on the science-based targets, which means that what our projections are on investments are in line with the 2-degree scenario on global warming, and that's how we're taking decisions. I have a view on when we take decisions on what the CO2 budget is, if you may call it that way, what the impact is, and we ask ourselves the tough questions on some of the projects. Do we still want to do them? I mentioned earlier gas as an opportunity. Our gas generation plants, the way we're planning them for the future, will be green gas ready in 2030 at the latest. And so absolutely, I believe that that's our responsibility, and I hope other boardrooms and are also are moving that way in terms of taking the decisions on thinking about what it means for the planet. Because again, I can only reiterate, for me, those are related. If you don't build solutions for the future, then quite frankly, reality will catch up with you. And some of these write-downs that you mentioned are, of course, a proof of that.
I'm going to go to Fiona and then Aaron Arbour, and then I'm going to switch to the topic. One thing I think really important that you mentioned, Judith, is you talked about recognizing that the environment and the economy are not in contradiction. That seems to me in some ways the fundamental reframing that is taking place, or has taken, obviously in your mind and your boardroom, it's taken place, but still in some places and in some boardrooms, there's an assumption that there's a trade-off, that there's not, that you can't have both. So I think you're pointing to the need to get to the place where there is no contradiction. This seems to be really fundamental. Fiona, you wanted to go to you next, and then to Aaron Arbour, and then I want one last question, then we'll go to the audience.
Thanks, Nigel. So I do think that that there's a large cohort of companies who do believe, as the investors do, that the transition is inevitable and that it is going to happen, and they're trying to get ahead of the curve. And they understand that the longer that they leave the transition, the more forceful that it's going to have to be, and the more disorderly it'll be later. So that we may as well be trying to make sure that we have an orderly transition.
And that's really the message behind your inevitable policy
in
response.
our inevitable policy response, and we've done a lot of work on this, and we've looked at the areas that we think policy levers can be pulled. But I was talking before about Climate Action 100 plus, and I think the other thing that I would say is that while we've had great success with Climate Action 100 plus, and I mentioned, you know, some of the large companies who have made some significant announcements, it doesn't happen at the same pace across the world. So what's happening in Europe in engagements with the major oil and gas sector is not the same as the conversations that are happening in the United States. Or the conversation's the same, but the outcomes are not the same. So the engagements that have happened with, you know, Chevron and Exxon, for example, we haven't got these outcomes there. Yeah. And I think that comes down to, as well, the politics. So sometimes we can focus on the successes where we're getting success in Europe, but forget about and not mention the others. So I think that is one of the problems. So I think that in those countries, and we are starting to see that happen, we've seen that in the recent AGM season, investors need to take another step and say, where we're not seeing boards take climate change seriously when we believe it's inevitable, we need to remove those board directors. We need to start voting against their re-election. But then, of course, in different countries, you've got different powers to be able to do these things as well, because I think that's the only way at the end of the day to bring about some of the changes that we need.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think also, I mean, to those in the audience who've not seen the PRI work on inevitable policy response, I'd recommend you look at it. I think that with the TCFD, there's a lot more people looking at future scenarios, but sometimes from what I've seen, there's some rather simplistic thinking, like, will we have a 2-degree world or a 4-degree world? When actually it's the trajectory that's really the thing that's going to make or destroy value. So if you're not ahead of the curve and policy comes in very quickly, as the IPR work suggests, then you've got a lot of stranded assets and destroyed value. Arunaba, let me turn to you, and then I'm going to last question. I'll start with Jennifer.
Yeah, 2 quick points. You know, at least in India, you got to recognize that if we have 200,000 large industries, we have 63 million small, micro, medium enterprises as well. Yeah. So, you know, the nature of the boardrooms look very different in these 2 categories. Of course, as I said, the kind of capital that needs to go into the large industries, we already have had for the last 8 years an energy efficiency trading platform for those large industries. Now they need to actually bend the curve, right? So the Indian cement industry might have the lowest footprint in the world, but the Indian steel industry could do a lot better, right? Yeah. So at this moment, unfortunately, there is hesitation to put in the high capital investment for a very different kind of emissions trajectory. So how can we smoothen that investment? Because the willingness is there, right? For the micro, small, and medium enterprises, it's more about a fuel switching story. Because they go from month to month. It's really, the capital investment is really not what they can be thinking about unless they are part of a long supply chain of a larger conglomerate. And so again, smoothing out the working capital requirements for these guys can actually very quickly begin to change cluster by cluster. We've surveyed hundreds of clusters across India where this can begin to change. One last point. Governments right now, another hook that we have is governments right now are not just looking to create jobs. They're looking for money. No government has easy money right now. And that's where the reform of energy subsidies comes in. Yeah. India spends $38 billion on energy subsidies, 7 times more on fossil fuels than on renewables. You want to switch towards renewables, save money on energy subsidies. And in fact, we have not passed on the low fuel costs to consumers. We're actually increasing the taxes on them at the pump. Similarly, we shift to 30% of electric vehicles by 2030. We save $6 billion of oil imports. We shut down 25-year-old coal power plants. We save $2.5 billion. You try and retrofit them to meet pollution standards, it costs $2 billion. It makes more sense to shut them down. So when governments are looking for jobs and looking for money, you again have an opportunity to say, look somewhere else.
Right. Perfect segue, because I want to turn to Jennifer. I want to just wrap now by just asking you all for your favorite example of a smart policy measure. And Arunaba, you just laid that out really nicely. This was kind of my point about in an era of fiscal restraint, just asking governments to keep spending money is going to run out of road at some point. All right, so things like clear end dates or ratcheted product standards, or shifting the fiscal incentives around from fossil fuel subsidies to carbon prices or coal cesses as you have in India, or all things which can be neutral or positive for the Treasury. Let me start with Jennifer, as you've been studying this. I would tell you my favourite example of a smart green policy measure is the requirement which the French government have put on their bailout of Air France to ratchet up the use of sustainable aviation fuel. To get to 2% in the mix by 2025, it sounds like a very small amount, but we know that industrial transformation always happens exponentially, and the current level is 0.01%. So that's a 200-fold increase in just 5 years. If every government in the world did that, would be well on the exponential curve to decarbonising flying. So let me start with Jennifer. Your favourite examples or your strongest advice to governments of the kinds of policy measures which will lock in and accelerate green growth.
Yeah, well, I'm going to point to a couple of different things I think need to happen in those domains. So first, I also think that the Air France example is a wonderful one. But there's something that I think is quite compelling about this technology question. When I look at things like the green hydrogen needs that we anticipate especially for the hard to abate sectors, this is a perfect moment to say we're going to set a target about where and how our economy will be generating green hydrogen in the next decade, right? So there are some very real targets and indicators that policymakers can put in place in order to signal that's where they want investment, in order to signal that that's where they're going to be building programming around research and development, deployment, and commercialization.
Yeah.
I want to note, though, that one of the things that I found really interesting this week was Chile came out with its revised nationally determined contribution for the climate process. And they did a couple of things that I think would be extremely important for any government to be looking at right now. They included a social pillar. So where in your recovery programs are you looking at this clean energy transition as part of your economic recovery program, and what metrics are you putting in place? And can you then take that into your climate change conversation around just transition? How do you do distributional level targeting with your policies around individual consumer or household relief? Can you help with those kinds of programs, especially for those individuals whose jobs will be at risk because of this transition? And secondly, I thought Chile did a very interesting thing. They actually did change from an intensity target to an absolute target, and they set a peak year for their carbon emissions. If every one of our climate conversations were linked to our stimulus conversations in a very concrete way, we would make a lot of progress to restructuring our economies and the signals in our economies that would allow us to do a better job of holding ourselves, our governments, and our businesses accountable to making progress. The Science Based Targets Initiative is a really good platform that government can lean into in terms of what they expect from industry. But we have not yet seen those linkages between this broader climate community and some of the fundamental economic stimulus and COVID relief packages that are being proposed. I think that's the opportunity that we need to seize.
No, that's great. And I think your point about the links to social elements really goes back to some of the conversations about the realpolitik of governments having to intervene in the economy in such a big way, and we. Right. So, anybody else? We've got some questions from the audience. But if anyone has got a favourite stimulus idea, I'm all ears. Fiona.
Look, I don't know if it was a favourite.
Fiona, and then Aaron Arbor quickly, and then I'm going to go to the audience questions.
I'll be really quick. I don't know if it's a favourite because a few of those were already mentioned, but the Canadians did link some of the relief that they were providing for large companies to TCFD reporting. I thought that was quite smart, as in, let's not make this condition free. Let's make them do something. Yep. And they had the climate side, but they also then had a linkage around issues to do with collective bargaining, etc. So it had a job sort of social labour force element as well. So there's even small things you can do.
Yeah, hard to know how impactful those would be. It reminds me a bit. There's slightly disappointing news from Japan today. Their review of export finance for coal. They said that, as far as I read it, that they will continue, but they will I think, have an expectation that recipient countries will have enhanced NDCs and long-term strategies. So it could end up slightly, like in order to get access to coal finance, you have to commit to not having coal. So it could end up having a desired effect, but it looks a bit strange in the first place. And Naraba, you had an example.
Yeah, one quick idea, because social distancing norms will continue to be enforced even when the economy opens up, India, where millions of people rely on either just walking to work or public transport, are going to be worried about, can I get into a crowded bus or a crowded metro? So already we are seeing a spike in the demand for motorcycles and scooters. Yeah. Now, if we could link that, so the guy who was going by bus is now going to spend maybe, 10,000, maybe a couple of $1,000s to buy a motorcycle. Can we link that to a financing incentive to create a massive market incentive for electric bikes? Right? You immediately change the incremental story of electric vehicles towards something that transforms the market. Yeah. And the assembly lines are already there. You just need the market size to kick in.
And you've got some good examples in India with some of the energy efficiency work on light bulbs and others where policy has been used to drive mass market demand to drive the cost down.
Exactly. Use the advanced market commitments for that.
Yeah, great. Okay, wonderful. I'm just let me just end with a couple of quick audience questions. First question, does the panel feel that government action will be the most important factor in building back better, or will it be something else? So just sort of 1 or 2 word answers from everybody. Is it government's the most important, or is something else? I'm just going to point. Judith.
No, I think it's definitely a mix, of course, but government can create the right opportunities. Again, we're talking about trillions here of money that will become available, and if you point it in the right direction, take a strong view on what technology can succeed and needs to be scaled up, and I really think governments can help there. But then, of course, as companies, we need to look at where we invest and make sure that that is future-proof, like we've mentioned earlier.
Right. It's something we always talk about, and we did a report with WRI a couple of years ago, what we call the ambition loop. The private sector can go so far that helps, but then that can encourage bolder policy, but then you need bolder policy to raise the floor, and the two kind of reinforce each other. Let me have one next question. We've mentioned hydrogen a couple of times. So one question is, how important do the panel think the European Commission's announcement of a hydrogen alliance was? I don't know if anybody knows enough about that to answer, but
I'll answer, not because I'm familiar with all of the details of that, but I do think that we're part of the Energy Transition Commission, and we have been examining the role of hydrogen in the hard-to-abate sectors, as I know a number of organizations have. And I don't think that the role of hydrogen can be understated at this time. We really do need to move quickly towards alternative power structures and not just electric power, but the thermal power for heat in industry at all scales. I think the questions are not just associated with is it blue hydrogen from methane, or is it wind powered green hydrogen, which I hope we're seeing numbers that indicate it will be easily moved towards a green hydrogen approach. But it's also around the distribution and the form of hydrogen and the infrastructure needs in order to deliver safely and to deploy hydrogen into the economy, and business and policy will have to be aligned with that infrastructure development.
Great. Well, I'm gonna wrap it there. First of all, I want to thank the panel for a lively conversation and for all your insights from very different perspectives. Certainly a lot of food for thought. I kind of end on that point about hydrogen, that all of our empirical evidence shows us that when we make industrial transformations, they take a long time to get going, and then they go exponential and happen very, very fast. And as we've talked about, we're now in the middle of that very fast transition on energy generation, and the costs are coming down on storage, and now hydrogen is another big chunk in electric vehicles, and with some of those sort of demand measures that Aaron Arber talked about, or some of those kind of innovation packages which set the direction of travel and stimulate it until the cost comes down so that markets can take off. I think there's lots of reason be optimistic. And as Jennifer said, it's still very early days in terms of all of the stimulus packages. The trillions that have been promised have not yet all be dictated. So there's plenty of time to influence those stimulus packages so that they do drive the economy to a clean, healthy, resilient one, which we know that future generations are all looking to us to deliver. So thank you to everybody. And I'm going to hand back to Gareth from Reuters now. Over to you, Gareth.
Thank you very much, Nigel, and thank you very much, panelists, for a brilliant discussion there over the last hour. Coming up, you're going to hear from Influence Map CEO Dylan Tanner, as well as from Tom DeLay, CBE, who's the CEO of Carbon Trust. He's going to be in conversation with Owen Rolt, who is our head of energy transition down here at Reuters Events. But before we get to that, I'd like to pass over to Reuters editor-at-large, Axel Threlfall, for an exclusive fireside chat with Lord Brown, former CEO of BP. Over to you, Axel.
Thank you.
Goodbye.